All right, inshallah. So we're going to start now because it's 4 or 5, and we'll make sure we have enough time for the presentation. Again, Jazakumullah khair to everyone for attending today. Thank you very much. This is going to be our 4th and final Ramadan session. Kind of capping off the last 3 weeks. You can catch the recordings for our first session on liberalism. Then it was feminism. Last week was scientism, and today, inshallah, we're going to be discussing secularism. All interrelated topics, but each one was a little different. So, it's going to be presented today by Sister Daniyah. Sister Daniyah completed her Bachelors in Religion and Middle Eastern Studies, and did her Master's in Religion, focusing on religious pluralism, spirituality, and Islam in America. She currently teaches and is involved in youth work. Sister Daniyah, by the way, is also part of the Al-Arqam team. So a lot of the background work that gets done, she has a great hand in, and she's one of the editors for the upcoming 4th edition of our Studies in Usul al-Fiqh book, which will be out soon, inshallah. More details to come. But with that being said, not taking any more of your time, Sister Daniyah, whenever you're ready, please feel free to start.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I hope you're all doing well, inshallah, and making the most of the last few days of Ramadan. Inshallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept all of our efforts and allow us to continue to strive to attain closeness to Him in the months to come, inshallah. So starting off today's discussion is actually, it's a little bit interesting that we're starting, or rather we're ending the Ism series on secularism. And I say that because, we're kind of going full circle, so to speak. With secularism, as we discussed today, I think it's important to kind of keep in mind that liberalism, feminism, scientism, and many of the other isms that exist, in many ways were given the space to thrive and continue to thrive because of secularism. And so my intention today, with presenting secularism is to primarily avoid presenting it in a purely theoretical way, or even as a simply historical phenomenon, but also to kind of, but more so to present it in a way where we understand secularism to be a reality that we all are living under, and a reality that impacts the hearts and the minds of Muslims moving forward. So with that being said, inshallah, let's take a look at the objectives for today. So if we could go to the next slide, inshallah. Okay, so some of our presentation objectives are the following. The first being that I think it's really important that we contextualize discussion itself, right? We have to question, well, why is this topic of secularism, and by extension, the last 3 weeks that, the isms, why are those important topics to discuss as Muslims today? So inshallah, by the end of our presentation, I'm hoping that we gain some clarity as to why these topics are prevalent and important and should be topics of discussion. The second, more kind of obvious point here is, well, defining secularism itself, right? What is secularism? What are some of the more salient assumptions that secularism makes, and how can we kind of navigate that by understanding that some of secularism is most certainly based, within a historical reality, and then, by extension, carrying that through to, the implementation of secularism and how we kind of have to navigate being practicing Muslims under a secular society. So inshallah, today I'm hoping that we can address all of these issues, and then I'm hoping that we can wrap up discussion with some healthy conversation on steps forward, moving forward, so that we just don't, understand secularism as a quote unquote problem, but we kind of come up with a healthy solution to kind of navigate it while keeping our deen intact and holistic. Okay, so next slide, inshallah. Okay, so the first point of contact that we have to take into consideration here is that when we talk about Islam as a complete way of life, and for those of you that attended Al-Arqam's previous session on Islam, a complete way of life, hopefully we're clear in the sense that Islam offers a specific worldview. And when we say worldview, we are talking about a few factors at play, right? We can define worldview as a composition of the total assumptions that or presuppositions that we have about the world, stemming from our purpose in the world, teleology, to epistemology, right? Valid sources of knowledge, ontology, the state of being, the different political systems, moral ethics, communal laws and origins, and aesthetics, which include culture and arts into it. So when we talk about Islam being a complete system, complete way of life, it necessitates that the Muslim adopts a complete Islamic worldview that is grounded and is centered on the Islamic aqidah. So then that kind of begs the question, then where does secularism kind of fit into this? And I think that it's really important for us to understand that secularism and then the isms that follow and the isms that continue to thrive in our society, they all carry their own set of assumptions about the world, right? About the material world that we live in. And they all present their own worldviews, so to speak, and their own ideologies through which, you know, their constituents need to abide by and function. And so when we talk about kind of balancing or navigating our Islamic identity alongside, you know, other isms and other worldviews, we have to be really careful in understanding that distinctions need to be made, right? Distinctions need to be made for the sake that we're able to separate between truth and falsehood, right? Dr. Sharif At-Tubki brings up a really important and really interesting and unique way of looking at a worldview, and he likens it to the grammar of thought. And what he says here is if you were to take into consideration a child that maybe is exposed to more than one language, and during those formative years, as they're learning and as they're growing in their language, you know, you don't expect a child to speak perfectly at a young age, right? You expect them to make mistakes and blunders. And in the case that they're exposed to other languages, they very well may borrow from other languages and kind of mesh that into their conversation. And so that end result is really going to be like an amalgamation of both of those two, right? And so similar, if we take a look at a worldview, we are able to kind of do the same. If we're not able to separate between truth and falsehood, we may very well be in that situation of a child where we're bombarded by different ideas that exist. Our Islam and our practice of our deen is not in a bubble. And so we are influenced in prevalent and unique ways and impacted and molded by the ideas that surround us, from whether they be cultural trends, social norms, or even the isms that serve as the foundational blocks of the society that we live in. So truly discussing these topics are definitely important to understand not only how Islam views these topics, but also to see how much these topics in turn have influenced and impacted our Islamic practice and our conception of our deen. So next slide, inshallah. Okay. So an important distinction that we have to make early on when talking about secularism, right? Secularism is a very large topic. It does have very deep roots. But I think that we have to make a really important distinction here between secular thought and then secularism as an institution, as an ideology. And so, you know, historians, when they cover secular thought, they go well before the 16th to the 18th century when secularism is kind of molded and formed, right? Secular here, and just as a side note before we get into the history of it, secular here is derived from the Latin word seculum, which means of this world. So over here, when we talk about this concept of secular, secularity, secularism, it is going to embed some type of distinction between the worldly, temporal, material realities that exist, and then also the quote unquote spiritual, eternal domain of life. And so when we take a look at history, we can kind of trace back secular thought to even the 3rd and the 4th century of St. Augustine of Hippo, who was a theologian and a philosopher, and presented, you know, Augustine presented this really interesting dynamic between secular and the temporal sphere. One being that, you know, Augustine highlighted this city of God versus earthly city lens through which Christians at that time in the 3rd and 4th century could kind of understand and grapple with their newly fractured Roman society. And what I mean here by this is that the city of God, as proposed by Augustine, encouraged Christians to understand the world around them as, you know, the city of God, referring to the eternal spiritual realm where, you know, man at this point, you know, he necessitates to give up that worldly pleasure of the world for the pleasure of the afterlife, really. So kind of shedding that material baggage, if you wish, of the temporal world for the sake of the afterlife, which is everlasting, and which includes and embeds God's pleasure. Whereas on the flip side of that, Augustine makes the differentiation between the city of man. And over here, the city of man is going to definitely address the sphere of life that is quote unquote worldly. And with this worldly materialistic realm, it entices man to indulge in desires and to indulge in that material world. And so what we see here pretty early on in the 3rd and 4th century is that just via this model where you have these two very opposed, diametrically opposed categories, you see that there is a distinction made in the psyche of, Christians at that time, where they view their reality, their lived reality, as kind of this tug of war between pleasing God and then also indulging or taking part in the worldly sphere. So this right here is a prime example of, some of the earlier traces of secular thought. And we have to be clear here, when we move on over to secularism as an institution, as an ideology, and as a worldview, we have to understand that worldviews aren't kind of baked, in a short amount of time. That you have to kind of plant. The ideas have to be planted and firmly rooted in order for that ideology to grow and for it to be what it is. And so secularism really is no different. It is, while it is bound by, some of the historical phenomena we'll talk about in just a moment from the 16th to 18th century, it most certainly did have some traces back in history, starting with that secular thought, starting with that separation of worldly life and eternal life. So I thought it may be helpful to kind of provide an example or to provide a summary of secularism early on before we delve into the history, just so that we don't get lost in the details of it all. So inshallah, by the end of the presentation, we will have established the following categories, the following stipulations that fall under secularism. Secularism often, as a worldview, is presented simply as the mere separation between church and state, right? And over here, when we talk about church and state, yes, that was an issue of the past, but if we were to make it more relevant for today and talk about it from modern terms, it's more so just the separation of religion from the public sphere or the public domain. And what we're going to be doing, inshallah, throughout the presentation is really questioning the completeness of this statement, right? While this may very well hold true, it's definitely and most certainly not the entirety of what secularism has to offer and what secularism continuously offers to the world and to those living under it. So as we'll come to see, secularism is an ideology that originates specific to Western Christian context. And it's really established with the hopes of partly preserving peace amongst the Christians and kind of curtailing that power that the Catholic Church had on society, right? The corruptions of the church, the stronghold that the church had politically, economically, materially, socially speaking. And so secularism really is going to be an ideology that forms as response to some of the atrocities carried out by the church. But as we'll see towards the end of the presentation, secularism truly does not end there. It doesn't end in the 16th to 18th century, right? Secularism is still alive and well today. And part of what that entails is that secularism is going to be an active push, an active push and pull to reconfigure the conception of religious understanding and practice. It is going to be a process of containing and relegating religion to the margins of life, where they are completely, unnecessary and unimpactful to those that follow them. And inshallah, we'll take a look at some examples soon, just to see what that looks like. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the realities of, history of secularism. There we go. So if we take a look at secularism, the first thing that we have to take a look at here is that historical context through which it emerges, right? So we're looking at the 16th to 18th century. By this point, as we mentioned recently, or as we mentioned previously, those seeds of secular thought have already been flourishing in society. But by the 16th to 18th century, you have secularism emerge in Western Europe during the Renaissance, Reformation, and then Enlightenment. right? So just to take a quick snapshot, this isn't meant to be a comprehensive overview, but just so that we could take a quick snapshot as to what some of the historical or important historical moments are for secularism. We're going to take a look at these three moments. The first being under the Renaissance. And, you know, as the Renaissance is unfolding, what we can do is categorize the Renaissance as a slight shift away from God and faith to humanism and the secular spirit. And what we mean by this is really that human beings, you know, during the Renaissance, you had the Christians still holding on to their faith, but viewing the world as holding inherent value in and of itself, without necessarily the afterlife attached to it. So there was definitely this focus on humanities and focus on language and arts, right, and tradition. And that all held its own intrinsic value, aside from it holding some type of spiritual, quote unquote, measure. Right. And by the time we make it over to the Reformation, and many of us may be familiar with Martin Luther from our basic world history books, Martin Luther is essentially going to lay a lot of the foundation of that secular vision. Right. And if we remember some of those theories of Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses on the church doors, expressing his discontentment with the church as an institution and the way that in which they're subjugating, or they subjugated those that followed them, and had that stronghold in society. A couple of things that we want to look at here, though, for the Reformation, or under the Reformation. The first being biblical criticism. And in this case, during the Reformation, Luther was one of the active members that really helped push this concept of biblical criticism. And that's essentially, you know, if we were to simplify it, it's really, it gave church members, it gave Christians the ability to open up their Bibles and to skim over and understand the text on their own, you know, on their own merit. And what this does is essentially, as Asad mentions in Formations of the Secular, what it does is it essentially liberates the Bible from the letter of divine inspiration, and it allows it to emerge as a system of human significances, right? So there definitely is that more human element where, you know, Christians were not dependent on the church providing its views on what the Bible says, right? Christians had that individual autonomy to open up their own texts, to sift through that own text and find meanings that resonated with them, you know? And what makes this a little bit more significant here is, especially in the case where, you know, Protestantism at this time, and via biblical criticism, is going to allow Christians to have a very new understanding of their religion, right? Primarily separating them from some of those acts, the you know, codes of conduct, and it's more so going to allow them to turn inward and to focus on faith and to focus on good intentions, and not be as connected via their actions, via their rituals, to the church as an institution. So there is this separation here that occurs during the Reformation. A second point that I think is really important to take into consideration is that during the Reformation, there is this healthy dose of skepticism that starts to emerge within the Christian population, right? And that skepticism centers on the source of inspiration itself, the Bible, right? And so the question at this point is, well, if God didn't directly have a hand in inspiring the Gospels, you know, what kind of power, what kind of legitimacy does the authority of, you know, society, in this case, the churches, what authority do they have in using that Bible against us in whatever means, right? And for those of us that are interested, and again, this is kind of just a skimming, those of us that are interested, I do recommend that you read up on some of the atrocities carried out by the church. I do want to highlight here that the Reformation obviously didn't happen in a vacuum. This group of Christians did have very legitimate concerns against the stronghold that religion played in their life, in society, and impact that it had on their lives, right? So these reactions definitely, well, as we'll come to see from the viewpoint of a Muslim, is definitely foreign to us, right? To have religion separated from the public sphere. For Christians during the Enlightenment and during the Reformation, it was definitely a natural byproduct of the atrocious reality that they lived under. So do keep that in mind when we talk about this historical context. Okay. The third point here, the third point that we're going to keep taking a look at here is the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is significant because it does highlight that moment in time where reason is influencing individual autonomy, right? Where you do have, deism taking shape and form and influencing a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers. And one important point here to highlight with deism is that oftentimes these philosophers who were deists themselves viewed the world as following. They didn't reject God, but they said that God, we can liken him to a clockmaker. He sets the world in order, takes a step back, and things function as they are, right? And so we see the shift in mentality here from religion as a sense of authority, as a religion as an institutionalized part of society, to now something that is very much separated from power, something that, where power itself and the religious or the church's influence in society is questioned in and of itself. In 1851, you actually have the formalized term secularism by George Holyoake, and essentially secularism was coined in order to, away from or replace labels of atheist, rebel, free thinkers, renegade, etc. Right? Those that viewed the Catholic Church through a specific lens. Secularism was just simply a word to kind of navigate those realities and to establish new norms. Okay, so based off of this very brief overview, this very brief historical context that we're looking at, we can highlight here that secularism did emerge from a specific context, a very specific real context, real issues that were occurring. But at the same time, we have to understand that it addressed a very specific Eurocentric problem. So when we talk about the separation soon, inshallah, between religion and the way that we carry ourselves out in the public sphere, we have to understand that it's not a one size fits all, especially from the perspective of a Muslim who sees no distinction, no separation between the personal and the private, right? And so secularism historically can be categorized as a phenomenon that allowed to put or strove to put the church in its place. But what we see here for today is that it essentially didn't end at the church. By extension, it includes religion as a whole, religious practice included. So if we could go to the next slide, inshallah, and take a look at some of the realities of secularism. Okay, so some of the realities of secularism here. At its core, we can highlight secularism as this struggle between, religion and state. And essentially that struggle rests on the foundation of being a power struggle, right? And it brings me back to kind of question that initial definition that we introduced, that oftentimes we are familiar with secularism as just simply the separation between church and state. Right. And, in the Thinking Muslim podcast, it reminds me, Brother Osman brought up a really important point. He said, even if we were to boil down secularism and make it as simple as separation between church and state, that still necessitates that we describe or define and highlight what religion is in order to separate it from that state. So this begs the question, and Talat Asad questions this multiple times in Formations of the Secular, well, who kind of has a monopoly to define what religion is? Right? And what elements of religion are acceptable and what elements of religion are unacceptable, right? And so this kind of can complicate in many ways the notion of religious pluralism that, these our secular societies pride themselves on. And it also should kind of allow us to question, again, the parameters that are established and who gets to establish those parameters through which religions function and flourish in society. Now, Kathleen Moore, Dr. Kathleen Moore describes this kind of question of, religion, society, and power. She kind of boils it down to this simple sentence. She says, essentially, secularism at its core is a struggle. It's a push and a pull between freedom of religion and freedom from religion, right? And kind of measuring how to kind of walk that fine line, it's constantly being reevaluated by the nation state itself, by the state authority. And so when we take a look at, secularism, secularism truly is simply just the state's effort to regulate, dominate, and police religious practice and understanding in the public domain, right? The state is, by all means, under secularism, is able to, has that green pass to interfere with anything that's deemed, quote unquote, wrong or objectionable. And inshallah, we'll be taking a look at a couple of examples here. But I think before we move over to the examples, I do think that this is a perfect moment just to kind of question when we as Muslims describe Islam as a quote unquote religion, right? I want us to really internalize the fact that language matters, right? And so when we say religion, religion by definition is carrying the entirety of this very complicated, complex, messy history that we just got a snapshot of. So I would encourage us to refrain from using the word religion. Worldview is most certainly more appropriate here, especially because religion, as we've just come to see, is something that is extremely privatized, by the authority of the state. And so it's unbefitting to understand Islam, which is a comprehensive system, as simply just a religion. Okay. A couple of ways that we can kind of take a look at the realities of secularism. Talal Asad says it's precisely in a secular state, which is supposed to be totally separated from religion, that it is essential for the state law to define again and again what genuine religion is and where its boundaries should properly be. So again, here the state has the power to define what acceptable religious practice is, what acceptable religious ideas are, and what is deemed okay and what is not, right? And obviously taking into consideration that religious behavior or understanding that isn't viewed as or isn't understood as acceptable by the state is subject to potential punishment via the laws in place, right? So we should kind of question these elements of or this mode of freedom that secularism kind of prides itself on. And inshallah, in just a moment, we'll kind of take a look at some of the major claims and assumptions that secularism makes. And we'll try our best to kind of highlight some of the contradictions that are embedded throughout. Robert Orsi, kind of going off of this point, emphasizes a very similar stance here, where that, in order to have the category of religion, in this case, I want us to put religion, acceptable religion, it was necessary for the state to define what is not religion. Right? So what elements of religion are unacceptable in both practice and idea? If we take a look at the IRFA, the passing of the International Religious Freedom Act, and this was under the Clinton administration in 1998, this act essentially gave unprecedented powers to the US to regulate religious practice and understanding. It didn't just kind of contain it within the US. It also allowed the US to have its hands internationally to review and to regulate religious practice in the name of protecting religious freedoms. And that's the irony that this all centers on, right? In the name of protecting religious freedoms, we're going to police and subjugate those who view differently than the acceptable modes of religious practice and understanding. We take a look at some examples here of, the Rand think tank that establishes a very set definition of what American Islam should look like, what the moderate Muslim should look like. And this should make us question here why a think tank is aiming to modernize Muslims. So what about Islam doesn't fit within the secular society, right? Especially if we're going to kind of toot the horn of pluralistic values and living in a free society that allows it. Why is it that Islam has to be, and by extension, other religions that fall under questionable territory, why do they have to be molded and why do they have to be maneuvered in very careful ways, right? And so one of the ways that that Rand kind of proposes we can foster a moderate Muslim network is through liberal and secular Muslim activists and academics and intellectuals, and the working alongside young, moderate religious scholars. They also note in their study that young Muslim women that are involved in equality campaigns and assist programs that promote democratic education and derive authoritative teachings, support democracy and quote unquote pluralistic values from Islamic texts. These are the outlets that are going to help create that quote unquote moderate Muslim. Right? So it is a very specific definition for a very specific imagination that, secular society has for Islam. And for you and I as Muslims, this should kind of set off some red flags, right? It should make us think a little bit deeper about what aspects of our deen are palatable to the secular model and what aren't, right? And if there are, and there most certainly, inshallah, we'll get to it, the aspects that aren't palatable, what does that then say about the way that you and I are going to practice our deens and the way that we understand and implement Islam in our lives, right? So it's definitely some food for thought there, and inshallah, I'm hoping once we move our way into Q&A that we can discuss it a little bit thoroughly. Another thing, right, if we talk about the counter-violent extremism program, right, via Homeland Security, where there is a recruitment of community leaders, social workers, teachers, public health providers to help assist the government in identifying who may be a quote unquote risk for extremism. The first question here is, well, who gets to define what extremism is? Going back to that initial point that we talked about, that Balad Asad kind of emphasizes throughout formations of a secular, who gets to call the shots, and why is it that the state has this stronghold to understand what parts, what elements of religion work and what frankly don't work, right? What's one point here with CVE that I think is worth noting is the fact that potential risk factors for extremism here include political grievances, ideology, beliefs, and values that don't align with the American vision. And so that makes us question, when we have very real realities that are occurring in the Muslim world, and very real issues with our current foreign policy, what does that then, or where does that push us, where does that usher us into if we're, if we are outspoken about certain atrocities, not in the name of humanism, but in the name of Islam, right? And so there is a very distinct distinction there that we have to point out here, that speaking on behalf of the deen to a certain degree is going to prove problematic under secularism. Right. And so inshallah, by our last slide, and I know inshallah we plan on talking a little bit about what's going on in Palestine and other places, but I think that it's worth noting here that our opinions are molded and shaped by secularism, and oftentimes it's at the expense of our Islamic identity and our Islamic understanding. So under a secular system, some of the last reality that I want to touch upon here is this idea of belief, right? We said that secularism polices our ideas. They have a strong hand in understanding what's acceptable religious practice and what's unacceptable religious practice. And those parameters are very much set in place. But there's another stipulation here that falls under secular liberalism, and that's the idea that beliefs here are mere opinions, and those mere opinions are equal in value. Now, what does this mean as, for you and I as Muslims? That means that to believe in Islam and to not believe in Islam hold the same intrinsic value under a secular system, right? And what we see here is kind of the blowback of this in society, where you have 1 out of 4 Americans that call themselves or fall under this category of nuns, who find themselves, and we're not talking about religious nuns meaning the absence of religion, where they may view themselves as atheist, agnostic, spiritual but not religious, or even unaffiliated with religious institutions, right? So where they find themselves in this category that religion truly plays no role in their lives, right? And Charles Taylor in A Secular Age talks about this at length. And for Taylor, being a religious Catholic, he's definitely emotionally charged when he presents his views. But I think what we can see here is that, according to Taylor, it's the reality of secularism isn't necessarily just the removal of religion from society, but it's the creation of a passive religion where religion essentially becomes irrelevant to living a quote unquote good life, a morally upright life, living with the realities of the world around us. Religion takes the back seat and the back burner here. So that is something that we should keep in mind, inshallah, when we do move forward and talk about in a bit, when we talk about Islam and the secularization of the Muslim minds and hearts. We have to question what aspect of Islam is becoming relevant, and how might we draw connections between this and also the crisis that we're facing in our communities, where you have tons of Muslim youth kind of really not finding a point in being a practicing Muslim. And I know that even within some of my, conversations with some of the youth, I've had some express, well, I could be a good person. Why do I need Islam? And I can't stress this enough. Secularism does a number on us without us realizing, as do the other isms. And I know that Dr. Ovamir and Dr. Osman mentioned in their talks that it's kind of the air that we breathe. And that is the unfortunate reality of secularism around us and the other isms, where oftentimes we're unaware of how much we've internalized these secular values, how much we've kind of relegated religion to the private sphere, so much so that it's really not in our spheres anymore, right? And so it truly is something to be concerned about, and something that needs to be discussed more at length.
I think you muted yourself, by the way.
Okay. How long was I muted? Did I finish?
Like a minute.
Slide?
Yeah,
Okay.
you did. I'm assuming it was next slide.
Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so points of justification here. Secularism falls under or has or carries certain assumptions, right? And the first being that secularism solves this issue of violence, right? We have in the past the church committing tons of atrocities, and we have this perception that religion is going to bring about violence. And so through the secular model, some of the assumptions that are made is that, well, secularism is by definition a prevention of violence, right? It allows for more cohesiveness in society, where you don't have tons of bloodshed unnecessarily in the name of this higher cause that people don't believe in, right? And what we see here is actually secularism brings about more violence, and has brought about more violence in society than even religiously motivated wars, right? And Dr. Al-Awaimed, in Understanding Secularism from Within Islam, highlights this really interesting point, where secularism shifts bloodshed for God, bloodshed for a higher purpose, to bloodshed for the nation, right? Attached to the secular model is really the continuation and the support of the nation state, right? And so what's justified here is shedding blood for the nation state, but it's not justified to have elements of war or casualties in the name of religion, right? And we have here, Talad Asad says, violence of religious wars in the violence of national and colonial wars. The difficulty with secularism as a doctrine of war and peace in the world is not that it is European and therefore non-alien West, but that it is closely connected to the rise of a system of capitalist nation states, mutually suspicious and grossly unequal in power and prosperity, each possessing a collective personality that is differently mediated and therefore differently guaranteed and threatened, right? So again, justifying this idea that causing or spilling blood in the nation or in the name of the nation state is justified by all means, but kind of attaching that or supporting that via religious thought and belief is unaccepted, right? So we have to kind of call that out for that contradiction there. Talad Asad brings up an important point as well, that secularism isn't necessarily this kind of utopian prevention of violence, but more so it's the regulation of violence, right? Who has the authority to commit violence? And obviously in this case, the easy answer is the nation state. And we see that through examples of foreign policy, where you have Western modernity and you have secular liberalism literally exported via political hegemony, causing bloodshed across globally, and it's justified, right? It's justified because secularism views itself as a solution, views itself as a reality that should be lived globally, right? If we take a look even at modern torture, right? Modern torture under secularism is completely justified. And this modern torture here is both physical and psychological. And we see examples of this that are way too close to heart when we talk about, Abu Ghraib in Iraq, and we talk about Guantanamo. It's all justified if it serves the agenda, if it serves the purpose that the nation state has in mind, right? So it's not this, very easy solution to rid society of violence. Violence isn't going anywhere. It's just whether or not our violence is justified through religion, or if it's justified through the continuation of the nation state. If we take a look at another claim that secularism has, another point of justification that it puts forward, it claims that it upholds universal rights and morality for all, for those living under it. And I know that in week one, when we talked about, or we covered liberalism with Dr. Ovamir, we talked about some of those natural assumptions, those natural rights that liberalism rests on. And one being that all men are created equal, right? We hear this time and time again. And one thing that we have to highlight here and to point out the elephant in the room here is really that, arguing that human beings all deserve equal rights does not guarantee those rights. That's number one. The second being that under the capitalistic, system that we live on, that secularism ushered in and allows to flourish and continuously flourish. Capitalism thrives and undergirds this idea of social inequality, for the benefit of modern power. So actually having inequality, actually not upholding universal rights and morality, is something that is a signifying factor of secularism. It's not that it removes it at all, right? And in this case, when we talk about morality, we could definitely say that, secular liberalism, morality here is based on individual right and autonomy, right? And we see that with the various segments of morality that we as Muslims are faced with kind of grappling to accept or to reject. And, if we take a look at human rights, we have to take into consideration that human rights depend on national rights, right? And those national rights at the end of the day are to constitute, to protect, and to even punish a citizen of the nation state if they view them as worth, if they have that green pass to do so, right? If we could move over to the next slide, inshallah, for some more points of justification. Okay. So the last two that I have here, one being the promotion of agency. Secularism seeks to or claims that it allows agency, and this is again partially in the name of religious pluralism. But what we see here is that secularism actually, in creating a secular society, actually pushes for an exclusive national identity that's going to bind the citizens together and give them a common creed, if you wish, right? It doesn't just stop there, though. What we see here is that secularism also pushes its agenda to quote unquote humanize the world, right? So this promotion of nationalism, whether it's exported through media or otherwise, is there with the intention of universalizing this moral project of the American nation state, right? And actually, if we take a look at nationalism, in many ways, it does echo a lot of biblical language. We take a look at, American political culture, and we could see that, as the Bible describes, quote unquote, the chosen people, that would be a light unto nations. We could definitely see that, democracy, human rights, and quote unquote, being free are the integral portions, the integral parts that our universalizing moral project rests on, right? That America feels entitled and secular states feel entitled to dispense secularism to the rest of the world in the name of spreading human rights, being free, meaning the freedoms, and democracy, right? So in this way, secularism isn't necessarily just allowing the thriving of political or religious pluralism. It really does create its own religious identity in and of itself, Right? And Robert Bellah actually proposes this concept of civil religion. He's gotten some pushback for it, but I definitely think that an element of civil religion here holds true. And civil religion, when we talk about it, Bellah refers to this concept of creating a unified nation using, our civil religion. And so some examples of what that might look like, if we take a look at religious symbols, we might say, well, in an American context, some of those religious symbols would be the unification of the American flag, that regardless of what religious background you come from, or if you have no religious background, you have these civil religious elements that form this common creed that bind us together and give us a national identity. Right. And so in that case, the American flag would be our religious symbol. If we take a look at texts, we can say that, maybe the Constitution in this case would be that document that Americans hold as something that is, carries a lot of value and weight and is something not to be tampered or questioned. Right. And so we see here that secularism truly in the name of allowing religious pluralism, in the name of allowing religions to function in a quote unquote neutral sphere, in a neutral space, it actually kind of creates its own level of religiosity attached to it, where you give, the constituents their own views of what's important and what's unimportant. And you bind them together using kind of this common language and this common goals. The next point here, and the last point of justification that I have, is fostering tolerance and neutrality. And in this case, secularism fundamentally argues that it is tolerant, right? And it is neutral. And the case of, the matter being is that secularism is most certainly tolerant, but it's only tolerant to things that it doesn't deem as important, right? And Qadad Asad kind of stresses this point where secularism can pride itself on facilitating an environment of tolerance, but the crux of it all is that it's intolerant to any opposing views, and that's the irony of the situation, really. So in this case, it's really not a matter of isolating religion, but it's an endorsement of another set of values and principles and common creed. Right? Dr. Stephen Prothero actually even takes it a step further, and he says that secularism in and of itself is the doppelganger of religion, right? That it kind of just picks up, if you think about it, it kind of takes that baton and carries off the mission of that Catholic Church before. So while before you may have a difference to believe, right? Secularism tells you can believe whatever you want to believe. But when it comes to the ability to actually practice those beliefs, there's legality behind it. Right. And so for you and I as Muslims, we have to keep that in mind, that yes, we're kind of told you can believe X, Y, and Z. You can attribute whatever beliefs you want to Islam. But when it comes to the actual implementation and the practice of it, there are strings attached. Right. And oftentimes roadblocks, and inshallah, we'll come to see that in just a moment, roadblocks in the way of doing that. OK. OK. What we find here, and this is the last point here, while we're talking about the legitimization of the nation state, I think part of the problem, arguably, is that we have some Muslim leaders, and without naming names, and I think it's clear enough at this point of who's outspoken in their views or not, but we do have Muslim leaders that legitimize the nation state and legitimize them partially because they're on their payroll, right? But we don't recognize nation states from an Islamic perspective. We do have a transnational understanding of what the Muslim Ummah is. And that alone poses a very real threat to secularism and the foundations through which it rests on, right? So with that being said, inshallah, I do want to just emphasize here with this last point that secularism, while historically we can categorize it as a reaction to the church's corruption and kind of stronghold on society, economically, politically, socially, we definitely can see that in many ways, secularism continues the legacy to forcefully carry out what the church already was doing. And if anything, we can argue that it does it at an even greater magnitude than the church had in the past. Now, especially with the globalization and so on, secularism truly is something that carries so much more of a threat than at that point that the church had in society. So with that being said, inshallah, I'll move on over to the last slide. Okay. So where does this leave us as Muslims? We talk about Islam being a complete way of life, and oftentimes that term, or that, unfortunately, it's sloganized, right? And what we often associate with it is that there's a degree of intentionality, right? We'll throw around like innamal a'malu binniyat, right? That you can carry out your day as a Muslim, carry out your life to the best of your ability, and you have lived Islam. And one thing that I want to stress here is that is a partial implementation of Islam. That is most certainly you doing your part as an individual to carry out your deen by doing your individual ibadat, and by maybe even earning in the halal, and carrying out your life with Islam on your mind, right, with the proper intention. But as far as Islam as a worldview, we have to understand that Islam is greater than just the individual obligations that you and I have. That Islam as a system addresses all aspects of lived experience, which includes the individual and on the collective level, the political and the social and the economic and the individual. And so what we have to do here is really understand that Islamic worldview is something that should be viewed holistically. And oftentimes when we take a look at the way in which we understand the deen, or the way in which we're able to practice our deen, we really are shortchanged in the way in which we're able to live Islam, right? And that's primarily because the Islam under secularism is an incomplete Islam. It's an Islam that is relegated to the spheres of, or to the private spheres. It's the Islam that you and I need to practice just when we enter into the masjid and into our homes. It's the Islam that when we leave our house, we may be able to, in an American context, forget the French context, but we're able to maybe wear religious garb and show those religious symbols, but they don't carry any other weight than that. It is the complete separation between a religious identity, a religious persuasion, and from the actual realities of society around us. So while you and I are able to, quote unquote, live Islam on an individual basis, Islam in all, for all intents and purposes, is reduced to essentially individual ethics. And that is not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed or intended with Islam as a guidance for all of mankind, right? And so I do want to kind of take a look at a couple of examples on the way that we can kind of draw how Islam's worldview, or Islamic worldview, is often muddied with this modern worldview that uses secular liberal values to either legitimize elements of our deen or delegitimize our Islamic conceptions and practice. The first point here being that, Islam, when we take a look at our ibadat, oftentimes we view them through a lot of secular liberal language, right? We view them through the lens of choice. So if we were to take an example here, and this one is usually pretty controversial, so I guess I'll roll with it. With hijab, for example, right? Hijab oftentimes will be introduced or campaigned on the center of choice, rights, liberation, right? It's a woman's body. She can do with it as she pleases. She can cover or choose not to cover, right? It's, instead of presenting this hijab in this case as an act of obedience, as law, it's introduced on the playing field of secular liberal language, and language matters, right? And we have campaigns run by like Nike, and we have other Muslim-owned businesses where hijab will be marketed as a way to kind of help uplift a Muslim woman in her ability to choose how she dresses, to choose her rights, to choose her liberation through it, and not simply as just simply an obligation, right? So in this case, it's not presented necessarily on purely religious ground, but more so on a secular ground. And that's where the problem stems, right? And this isn't to say, just to kind of nuance this just a little bit and make a note, it isn't to say that free will doesn't exist, right? When we talk about choice here, obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed you and I to choose to obey and choose to disobey. But that isn't really what's at hand here. What's at hand is that when we take a look at examples like hijab, or examples like any type of obedience on an individual basis, it's viewed through the lens of choice. And that language here matters because it shows that Islam, to a certain degree, has been secularized in the way that we understand it. And that's when it becomes problematic. The second portion here that I want to highlight here is the secularization of knowledge. Now, oftentimes we associate Islamic knowledge as, dealing with personal or developmental, growth, closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, focusing on elements of quote unquote spirituality. And, a really important point here to make is that when we take a look at like our Sunday schools or even, our Islamic schools, when we talk about the golden age of Islam, and we talk about how wonderful these Muslim contributors were, right? Where they were mathematicians and they were scientists in their own right. And they brought about all of these advancements in the world. But at the same time, they were fuqaha and they were, muhaddithin, etc. Those, when we present that as an example to take a look at, we oftentimes are doing the complete opposite today. We take a look at knowledge itself as either quote unquote spiritual or quote unquote secular, right? Where if we're studying, something that doesn't seem like it fits under Islam, whether it be math or science or etc., we don't view it to have any intrinsic quote unquote spiritual value, right? And so when we talk about an example of what this may look like today is actually when Al-Arqam posted the flyer for this Ramadan series a while back. I think it was like a week or two before Ramadan. It was actually questioned. The topic selection was questioned on the basis of the topics not carrying or not being appropriate for the quote unquote spirit of Ramadan. Right? That why would we be spending Ramadan 4 Saturdays discussing isms, discussing ideas that surround us, versus talking about maybe how to soften your heart, or maybe talking about the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or maybe talking about things that are going to make us feel closer, quote unquote, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So again, kind of going back to that that experiential understanding of what religion is. And the problem here is, if we take a look at that question in and of itself, it doesn't even take critical analysis to highlight, why is it not quote unquote spiritual to discuss prevalent ideas, to discuss, haqq and batil, to discuss, Islam as being holistic and being challenged by the isms around us, by viewing, ibadat that fall outside, elements of Islam that fall outside of individual ibadat, that just simply add-ons, right? If that's not a reflection of a secularized mind, I don't know what else is, right? And so in this case, when we discuss ideas, when we discuss realities, the waqi' around us, we have to understand that is just as quote unquote Islamic and spiritual as learning about salah and learning about attaining closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and softening our hearts, etc. So we have to kind of put ourselves through this filter and reevaluate the way that we approach our deen, the way that we understand our deen, and the way that we understand our lived experience via our deen, right? Are we carrying secular liberal assumptions, and are we translating that and superimposing that onto our deen and the way that we understand and practice, right? So even if we were to take a look at elements of the Quran where we have Islamic texts that are clearly criticizing other beliefs, right, other ways of life, things that are not pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are those ayat then deemed as aspiritual topics, or are those just as spiritual as the heart softeners? So, we have to make sure that we are of the Muslims that view Islam as a comprehensive system, view Islam as being as a whole spiritual in nature, because every single aspect, every single facet of our life, and every single facet that Islam touches is in, or it should be for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So at the end of the day, we don't make this distinction between secularized spheres and religious spheres. We don't have the city of God and the city of man, right? We don't have the personal privatized religion and then the state enacting otherwise. In Islam, it's complete and it's holistic, and it permeates all aspects of existence. And so when we talk about even, the idea of of Islamic curriculums. I think that most people that work with either youth or within masajid or Islamic schools will all kind of have the same stresses and struggles, right? That there is no real curriculum, there is no real toolkit that we're offering our young Muslims once they enter into society. And I encourage you, if you were to ask an average Muslim that went through an entire 12 years of Islamic school education, and you ask them, what is Islam to you? I promise you it'll be a secularized, individualistic, private affair that deals with the individual. Most Muslim students that graduate from an entire curriculum, entire background, will not present Islam as a complete system, complete way of life, and that's primarily because they haven't been introduced to it as such, right? And that's a huge problem, that we essentially are compartmentalizing our Islam into our curriculum, and then we question, well, why don't our youth have yaqeen, right? Why don't our youth have the certainty in our deen? If we're presenting our deen as a very loosely strung compilation of individual ethics, right? Then most of them will clearly say that they can kind of gain those values, right? Being a good person elsewhere, right? When we establish or present Islam as something that addresses all aspects of one's individual life, one's personal life, and then as well offers solutions to a lot of the very real problems around us, that is what partially gives an edge to our youth when it comes to their confidence and understanding Islam. And so I think when it comes down to the secularization of Islam, I think that we have a lot of conversations that need to be had surrounding presenting Islam as it ought to be presented, presenting Islam as, not in a disjointed set of ethics, but rather as a system that addresses the realities that surround us and continue to surround us, and addresses them in the most perfect way. So understanding the comprehensive way of life will then allow us to, by extension, understand the limits of a lot of these surrounding paradigms and isms that we're kind of bombarded with. And so with that being said, I think inshallah we can move over to Q&A, and I think that if we could continue conversation perhaps to kind of talk about how we can move in the direction of providing ourselves with viable options to be confident in our deen and understand that the deen is not a deen that fits within a secular model. The deen is not a deen that can be secularized, and that in the process of us secularizing our deen, we lose our deen and we lose ourselves, right? And so it's a huge question, and inshallah, I'm looking forward to some of our responses. So with that, I'll wrap it up.
Jazakallah khairan, Sister Daniyah. So yeah, we do actually have a good list of questions here. So starting from the top, what role did understanding religious texts play in the history of secularism?
Yeah, so I mean that in and of itself is a big question. If we're talking about understanding the religious texts, meaning the Bible here, we definitely see that historically the church had the ability and to understand, interpret those religious texts, and then kind of provide those realities to its followers, right? And so when we see that element of biblical criticism emerge during Luther's time, we see that it really is that push to kind of differentiate from that, right? And so when it comes to secularism, I would stress that, individualizing study allowed secularism to take shape the way that it did, right? And I know that Sister Aisha in week 2 talked about the likes of Ayan Hirsi Ali and some of those feminist academics that view themselves as Muslims, but very well are doing a lot of similar patterns here with biblical criticism. It's as if we're living in a post-Reformation, Islamic reality, where we're encouraged to kind of open up our texts and read them as we see fit, and then to move along. And so I definitely would say that secularism emerges as a way to grapple with the church's dominance, but at the same time, they don't have usul like we do, right? So it may not, the shoe doesn't necessarily fit when we talk about the Islamic context, but I hope that answers the question. And if not, feel free to message Q&A.
al-Fiqh. So there's actually another question that kind of ties into that one. It says, I thought historical biblical criticism emerged in the 18th century. Is this different from the biblical criticism that you're mentioning in reference to Luther now?
So when we talk about the period that we talked about was from the 16th to the 18th century. So this falls under that.
All right, so now next question then. How would you respond to those who say that secularism, though it defines other religions, offers more tolerance than one single religion?
Yeah, I that question is, well, number one, I would say I would encourage that, to look at the realities of secularism. What tolerance do we have when we have in a post 9/11 age with the Islamophobia on the rise? What tolerance does secularism offer in France when they literally stripped Muslim women the opportunity to wear the hijab, right? I would encourage us to take a look at our own texts and see how in an Islamic model, how we view the non-Muslim counterparts in our society, and how Islam offers the allowance of religious tolerance and religious difference to function within an Islamic system, right? And we actually have documents, manuscripts of primary sources rather of Jewish groups that are calling other Jews to come to the Muslim world, Muslim lands, because they can freely practice their deen there. They're not subjugated. So I think that question, number one, is to take a look at the realities of secularism. It's not cracked up to what it says it is in terms of tolerance. And then number two, to take a look at what Islam says about tolerance and how Islam facilitates tolerance within its system. But yeah.
So next question says, what do you think of Muslims who attempt to use secular logic in an attempt to push certain Islamic rights?
Yeah, I definitely don't think, I think we're headed down a rabbit hole if we do that. I think that Islam can stand on its own, right? And I think that what happens is when we use secularism to justify Islamic behavior, you can very well use secularism to delegitimize Islamic behavior at the same time. You can't have your cake and eat it too, right? So I definitely think that it's a slippery slope. And I think that it takes understanding and learning the deen to be able to confidently present it to a secular crowd or non-secular crowd in the way that it deserves. But I think that using language and using different ideas to present our own it kind of insinuates the fact that our own ideas can't stand up on their own 2 feet. And I think that's completely the furthest thing from the truth.
So the next question is, would you recommend avoiding affiliating ourselves with concepts like activism and social justice because it wouldn't be understood from an Islamic perspective?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to be said on social justice and activism. And I think that those that are involved, even within our Muslim community, even those that are very well known, I think that they will be the first to tell you that you have to walk a very fine line between social activism or social justice movements while keeping your Islamic identity intact. And what I mean here by that is, social activism and social justice movements, just activism in general, the modern sense, carries its own stipulations, its own realities, and not all are compatible with Islam. And I think that what we see here today is kind of, Muslims are living the reality of what that looks like. You can very well argue for a social justice reform or for a specific cause, but then when another cause comes your way that is antithetical to Islam, you get stuck, right? And so I think that when it comes to addressing social issues, it's not to say that, alliances or getting involved is wrong, but it's saying that, giving dawah is a very different reality. You're working on your own terms than, sometimes getting involved in some of the social justice efforts and movements. And so you never want to lose your deen or never want to lose your principles or feel like you have to support something at the expense of your beliefs. And I think that we see some examples of that, of even like Hasan in office, right? Being in the position that she's being in and supporting some of the causes that she supports, very problematic from a Muslim perspective. And then, what causes even lasting damage to that is the impact that it has on young youth that look up to those people that are involved in those social activist spheres, right? So I think that if you want to talk about activism, and it's an easier proposition, said than done, I think that always work on your own terms, so you're not defined by other people's definitions and other people's principles and parameters.
So the next one is more of a comment than a question. It's saying the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has taken a bold stand to criticize China and India on their human rights abuses against Uyghurs and Kashmiris. So there is a positive aspect to the IRFA as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing that I want to stress here, and I guess it kind of ties in with the social activism element here, or comment that we just made. It's not to say that, we're looking at things black and white, right? It's not to say that there are no potential benefits here. But then what I would kind of stress here is when it comes to other issues that are Islamic, what is that same bill doing, right? When it comes to the subjugations of Muslims in Rohingya, right? What does that bill do, right? So we could take a look at specific examples. And I think we also have to be aware enough to know that oftentimes these calls are not said in a vacuum, right? There are other elements at play here, right? So denouncing the Uyghurs in China or China's role in those concentration camps and the re-education camps, we have to kind of ask ourselves: is it really in for just simply the fact that they're coming to the call of Muslims being subjugated and Muslims being re-educated and stripped of their deen? Or are there other benefits that come along with that act, right? In the process of denouncing some of the atrocities that are happening with those Muslim brothers and sisters in China, right? So it's not as straightforward as saying that, well, there are some benefits to a law, but at the same time, I think that from an Islamic perspective, viewing things a little bit more holistically, viewing politics as something that isn't just kind of child's play, right? That there are multiple factors at play. I think that we have to kind of look a little bit more critically. But yeah.
So the next one is also a comment too. It's citing a book, Before Religion, A History of Modern Concept, basically stating that religion in general is defined as a social cultural system of designated behaviors and practices, morals, beliefs, worldviews, texts, sanctified places, prophecies, ethics, or organizations that relates humanity to supernatural, transcendental, and spiritual elements. However, there is no scholarly consensus over what precisely constitutes a religion. So this is all to say, therefore, since there is no agreed upon definition about religion, I do not see any problem in translating the Arabic word deen to mean religion, knowing that even the term deen is a general term used to describe Islam and other religions.
Yeah, I think that's, in a way that question, Barakallahu Fiqh, I think it brings up a really important point here. Yes, while deen is something that is general, and while religion itself has no consensus, because primarily due to secularism, religion is still being played with and toyed with and molded and maneuvered at the state's dispense, right? My point here is that instead of putting yourself in a position where your language potentially can box you in to one's conception of the day, right? So the understanding what religion is at that point in time, use our Islamic terms to highlight. So even though deen is general, but describes something that religion in and of itself today doesn't, and we don't know what religion is going to find in the future, right? So even though it's kind of moldable, I definitely still would be want to encourage us to use our Islamic language because without realizing it, language does play a part. I was reading a post earlier today on even this issue going on in Palestine, right? And how a lot of what's being posted on social media mentions Israel's offense, right? Israeli officers using Israel over and over and over again. And technically speaking, nowadays there is an Israel, right? Illegitimate is of a state that it is, we put that on the side. But I think that using that in the Muslim psyche, you ask yourself, what does that do to our conception of Palestine? that there is a Palestine and that there is an Israel. No, there's an entirety of Palestine and there's an occupier, right? So the language that we use here is important. And so I would argue, refrain from using religion for that sake, because language does carry weight. Language does change the view through which we understand the world around us. And to say that Islam has a very unique way of looking at the world requires us to then tap into Islamic language. That's going to present us in the most authentic way.
Barakallahu fiki. So there was actually an addendum to that comment, basically saying the same case can be applied to the word deen when talking about secularism in Arabic.
Could
I
you
don't know
say
if you want to expand any further.
Yeah, I'm not, if you could kind of draw that, I may have lost it, but if you could kind of make those.
Yeah, basically that, because deen, when discussing secularism in Arabic, it doesn't carry one agreed upon definition is what I'm understanding from this. You could argue then that like using the word deen doesn't properly encompass this. I don't know if that's what the question is, or comment rather is.
My response to that would be, does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not say in the Quran, inna ad-dina 'inda Allahi al-Islam? Right? So yes, the term is general, but it's specific to our tradition. I don't like using the word tradition. It's specific to our to our Islamic perspective, right? So I think that we could get lost in semantics here, but I definitely think if we're talking about from an Islamic perspective, I still say that using deen, using something that is in our timeless book, whether it's general in nature or not, is better than using. It's not to say that you can't use religion, but it's saying it's better than using religion that is in the hands of, limited beings limited humans that have this monopoly over what religion is of today, where religion is going to go tomorrow, and if there's going to be what type of religious practice there's going to be in the future. So I say go back to what our Islam says. And if I misunderstood the question, I do apologize.
So now, next question. What about the argument that the world has changed and that traditional Islam was appropriate for earlier centuries, but not today? So for example, rules of hudud cannot fit ability to evolve and fit into today's reality and be applied in the modern context.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I actually, I was hoping in a way that somebody would ask a question like that. I think that when we understand Islam as a complete system, I think oftentimes we conflate that with a historical implementation of Islam, and that's even to assume that there is one specific historical implementation of Islam. We have qat'i texts and we have dhanni texts, right? And so when it comes to re-envisioning and reimagining what an Islamic self-determined entity is going to look like, that in many ways has room for discussion, obviously using our texts and using the parameters set in place. But it's not to say that Muslims today are trying to reinvent a moment in history. But at the same time, with that being said, I will say when it comes to hudud and when it comes to stuff, my point on that would be that with the decisive, determined, concrete texts in our deen, there is no difference of whether or not that is a legitimate part or a legitimate addition to our deen, right? It's not that, well, we're just going to do away with X, Y, and Z because in today's context it doesn't work, right? Maybe aspects of Islam that are dhanni in nature that do have an element of discussion would bring about a different conversation. One thing that I would encourage you to do, because I don't see myself as completely qualified to speak on what that vision would look like. I know Dr. Ovamir had a wonderful podcast with the Blood Brothers on if the Khilafah is viable in today. So I would encourage whoever asked that question and those also on the call to listen to that podcast, because I think he did an excellent job, mashallah, on expressing the fact that there are nuances in the way that we have to approach this vision of Islam being an entity in its own right. but it isn't. And I think oftentimes what we are doing is that we confine ourselves to, realities that our deen doesn't necessarily necessitate or doesn't impose on us, right? And so I think that it's a matter of being creative and creative within the parameters set by our deen, not just the time of day or what's in and what's not. But definitely check out that podcast, Dr. Alimud. Mashallah, he did an awesome job.
So next question. In his book, The Myth of Religious Violence, William Cavanaugh argues that the wars prior to Reformation were largely not religious. He argues that it is a myth pushed to support the arguments for secularization. What are your thoughts about that?
I have not read that book. I think that I would be curious. I am curious to kind of know what kind of points substantiate or he offers to substantiate that claim. But I will say that when we take a look at people like Martin Luther and like the Enlightenment thinkers, like the philosophers, it's not to say that they were anti-religion. I think that even if we were to take a look at it, they were religious, but religious in maybe an unconventional sense at that time, right? So I definitely, I am curious to kind of see what that says. I can't pass judgment on whether or not I agree completely or disagree, because I think I would have to see his reasoning on that. But I do think it's an important point. But I would say that based off of the research that I've done, based off of my background with those moments from the 16th to 18th century, I do think that it's not necessarily the absence of religion or that they were atheist in nature, right? Martin Luther himself is a German monk, right? Like, it's not to say that they're upholding a lot of those traditional religious, they're not going in the direction of traditional religion at that point, but it's not to say that they weren't religious, right? So it's a very different, it's a very different reality. I think I definitely would have to check it out. I can't pass judgment on it.
So next question. Do you know when secularism arrived in the Muslim world, whether in structures or thoughts?
I don't know if I would put a date on it. I don't know if I can answer that question when it arrived, but I definitely think that, with globalization, I will say that there are traces of secularism well before. I think even with the abolishment of the Khilafah, we see, from the Tanzimat movements, secularism has taken on. This is one point that I think I probably missed in the presentation. Secularism emerges under specific principles, but it looks different depending on the context, right? And so for me, I don't think that I would be able to say when it infiltrated, Muslim lands, but at the same time, I will say that it does look different depending on where it is. And so maybe those traces, I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, but I definitely think that it would be interesting to kind of put a time on it. But what I will say is that, in cases like, when the Ottomans, when the Khilafah was abolished by, at a specific point in 1924, what I will say, even though arguably it wasn't in place before that, I will say that, the reaction in the Muslim lands to that abolishment and to the implementation of secularism was not a good one, right? And so I think that I would be curious to kind of explore that question. I don't have the answer for that, unfortunately, but if anybody else does, feel free to, reach out on the chat or send it to Q&A.
So a follow-up on that, do you know if we had our own quote-unquote Muslim Martin Luther, or was secularism something that was imposed on us?
If we had our own Martin Luther, secularism was imposed on us. I don't know if I could say that secularism in its entirety was imposed on us. There are definitely different figures within history that imposed secularism, right, or secular thought. But I don't know if there was one specific figure that we could take a look at, like Martin Luther.
So next question. Well, more of a comment, really. I would argue that historically, the Muslim world has experience with dealing with different nations, not nation states. Mm-hmm. I believe we haven't had one caliphate since the fall of the Abbasids. Correct me if I'm wrong. Not all Muslim quote-unquote nations were under the Ottoman.
Yeah, that's a loaded question. And I think that in a short Q&A, I don't think that I'll have time to kind of, and I don't think that I have a complete, I'm probably not the best person to respond to that. But I will say that I respectfully disagry with that statement. And I definitely don't think that it was after the Abbasids that we didn't have an Islamic establishment. But at the same time, I don't think that I'm able to kind of go through that right now.
So next question. Assalamu alaikum. How do you suggest we raise kids so that they understand Islam as a complete way of life versus being secular?
So I don't have any kids, but what I will encourage from having worked with the youth, I think that, and obviously this stuff is said a lot easier in theory than in practice. And I think that those of you that are parents probably can attest to that. But one thing that I will, stress here is I think that we don't realize how important knowledge is and the way in which we translate that knowledge over, right? So I think that telling or allowing a family to be raised in a way where they understand the fact that Islam isn't just when you walk into the door. It isn't just when you are in your private sphere, that you're constantly reminding them of the holistic nature of Islam. And we're going through history and you go through the principles. I think that, it'll give a full picture, at least if you offer that full picture versus, not offering it, it goes a long way. But I think that's a really heavy question. And again, unfortunately, I don't think that I'm the right person to answer that question. But I will say that, teaching is important for sure.
Vicky. Next question. How do you think secularism serves the war on terror agenda?
Secularism drives, or the war on terror, I'll put it this way, the war on terror, I think in many ways is legitimized through secularism, right? I think that highlighting what quote unquote is bad and what's not good, and partly using that as a means to infiltrate Muslim lands and to fight is definitely a way that secularism is used today. But I definitely do see secularism and the war on terror being intrinsically linked in more than one way. And I guess I'll just put it into that. Like that.
Well, Vicky. Next question. What are some ways for Muslims in the West to shift the paradigm and talking points that stem from secularism?
Yeah, I think it's partially twofold, right? I think on the one hand, it's being aware of Deen and being aware of what Deen encompasses. And number two, it's being aware also of secularism and being aware of secularism on its own merit and through the lens of your Deen, right? Passing judgment on what works in secularism, what doesn't, via an Islamic aqidah is key. Holding those discussions in our masajid, it's unheard of these days, right? I think that having elements where our communities are able to be aware of the fact of the ideas that surround them, aware of the fact of how our Deen addresses them is definitely a step forward, right? Having conversation is valuable, which is part of the reason why I really enjoyed that podcast with Dr. Al-Ayman, because I think that having those conversations is a step to opening and expanding the Muslim imagination and horizon, right? Not having them is going to take you nowhere real fast, right? So I hope I answered the question with that one.
So we only have a couple more questions left. So if you're good, we'll be able to keep going. Just finish these off. So next one, I think women have diverse reasons for wearing hijab. For many in Muslim countries, cultural reasons will probably predominate. For instance, where I'm from, hijab and niqab does not even equate to even being a Muslim. My question, how is the "it is my choice" reason better than that is how everyone dresses?
Yeah, I would say that they're both wrong, right? And I think that saying that it's well, number one, and again, this is just kind of adding that nuance here, that your choice does not equate free will, right? We all, alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us free will. But I think that when it comes to the purpose as to why you're wearing it, presenting it through the lens of simply choice and liberation is problematic. Number two, I think that wearing it simply because it's a cultural practice is also problematic. It's the reality of the situation in your context, but I think that it's problematic to be motivated to do that from that lens. And I think at the end of the day, it's really just a question of intentionality, right? Are you wearing it with law in mind? Are you wearing it with obedience in mind? Or are you not wearing it with obedience in mind? I think sometimes when it comes to either conforming or rebelling against social norms, I think that what we have to put first and foremost is, well, what is our standard to judge whether or not we are going to conform or rebel, right? It's a very easy way to say, well, you know, I'm wearing hijab because it's kind of the norm of my area, right? I'm wearing niqab because it is. But then I think, you know, changing your intention and wearing it for the right reasons takes it from that general cultural practice and uplifts it to an act of worship. It's just a frame of mind, right? And it's being aware. But I do see both cases as being pretty similar in the sense that you're not going back to the fundamental, and I'm not saying you as in you, but you know, one would not be going back to the fundamental purpose of what that hijab is for. But I am aware of the fact that Muslim women will wear the hijab for different reasons. It's just a matter of what reason did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mandate us to wear the hijab, right? And what does that hijab look like, right? So there have been like documentaries and that have come out, and you know, conversations surrounding, well, hijab to me is X, Y, and Z. Hijab is in my heart, right? Hijab can, you know, look like X, Y, and Z. And I think that what it requires us to do is to just go back to the basics, right? To just dial it back a little bit and kind of reground ourselves in what truth and what reality is, and then take it from there, regardless of what our cultural contexts are, regardless of what you know, ideas are pervasive in society that may influence the language we use to express our obedience. But I think that it all goes back to the fundamentals, the basis.
So in the interest of time, we are gonna just stop it here. We'll just end off actually with a statement of gratification. As someone said, excellent point. I learned a lot from these sessions and the insight it brought on the issue of how these isms affect Islam. So just passing that on. Yeah, with that being said, yeah, we'll stop here with the Q&A just because of the time now. But again, barakallahu feeki, jazakallahu khairan, Sister Daniyah, for the great presentation. And thanks to everyone who attended, you know, giving your time for this. Inshallah, we all benefited from the great presentations that have been given up until this point. Now, even though this is kind of like a Ramadan special of sorts, you know, we do have programs throughout the year, you know, different presentations and talks, and we're going to be publishing a book soon. You know, looking forward to publishing articles at some point too. So we have a lot of content, you know, that's going to be forthcoming, inshallah. So definitely please make sure to, you know, follow our social media accounts. It's going to be posted in the chat now, you know, so you'll be kept up to date on all, you know, all the happenings that are going on, what we have planned. And then also it's a great way for you guys to get in touch and let us know what your thoughts are. You know, how was this program, you know, for this month? If you have any further questions that weren't, you know, didn't have time to get it addressed for the Q&A now, if you had follow-ups on anything, or if you just have any suggestions on what you'd like us to cover, you know, because these were different topics that were chosen after, you know, a lot of discussion, but obviously there's a whole world of things to discuss, and you know, we'd like to have your feedback on, you know, on what you'd like to hear. So please feel free to reach out to us, follow us on all the different links, email us, and you know, we'll be sure to get back to you, inshallah, with that. So with that being said, oh, and also please, feedback is also really important as well. So not just suggestions, but we also really want to know, you know, what you thought of this, and if there's anything we can do better, you know, to deliver this information, inshallah. So with that being said, we're just going to close out now. Please, everyone, keep, you know, now it's Palestine is going through a really horrible time again. You know, they're like always trying to push further, see what they can get away with. You know, so everyone's aware of that news by now. But so please keep you know, Palestine in your area, and you know, really the entire Muslim world, China, Kashmir, you know, Myanmar, a lot of the different areas that, they come and go from the spotlight. We don't always hear about them. So it's easy to forget, but, please keep the Muslim Ummah, in your du'as, and, and inshallah, with a lot of the things that we're learning and discussing here, we are going to try to help to better equip ourselves to understand our situation, and see what can be done towards, or how we can contribute towards these things. So with that being said, again, please keep all of us in your dua, the Muslim Ummah in your dua, and please stay in touch. We'd love to hear from you guys. Barakallahu feekum. Jazakumullah khair. So I don't know if Ziyad or Yahya, if you guys wanted to close out with anything. I guess not. All right, thanks everyone for attending. Take care, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.